So my name's Chris. I am a person in long-term recovery, which is the politically correct term of, well, what I used to identify as being a recovering heroin addict. Alive and in the flesh, one of those street addicts that Dr. Hart was talking about back there. It's funny you identified us as the drug dealers too. I just want to point that out. Your intuition was correct. So I can tell you've been doing this for a while. I also work as a peer recovery mentor at OHSU Hospital on the inpatient addiction medicine team, which is referred to as IMPACT, and it just stands for Improving Addictions Care Team. So I work for Mental Health Association of Oregon, and we are contracted to provide peer services at the hospital. So the people that are talking after me, CVAB, would be the equivalent of that in this area, from what I understand. They kind of set me up perfectly in terms of like my personal story and what led me to heroin addiction and all that good stuff. And keep in mind, this is hindsight is 2020. I didn't realize most of this stuff until more recently. But really, my addiction probably started in my childhood with childhood trauma and abuse I was abused by a neighbor as well as a babysitter growing up, at a very young age. And it's strange because I had that so blocked out that I didn't even remember it happened until I was in treatment in my early 20s. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how deep-seated some of this stuff can be. I was a rambunctious kid, and I think it was probably part of this. I also had some mental health flavors when I was growing up too. I was a very anxious kid, and that came out in weird ways. And I started really what I would now call maybe disordered use, when I was about 13 or 14 with alcohol and pot, and, it just progressed, psychedelics, all that good stuff. And eventually I found opiates, and I was just thinking about the first time I tried them. My friend had given me a Oxycontin 80 and told me to cut, a piece off of it and crush it up and snort it and try this. So I did, because I was a rambunctious teenager. And it was actually really terrible when I think about it, because I was out in front of his house throwing up because it made me so sick to my stomach. So I'm throwing up in his front yard, simultaneously feeling amazing. And so we go down to the park to play basketball. I sprain the crap out of my ankle, but keep going because I just snorted a quarter of an Oxycontin 80 and then throw up again. And it was apparently that was the best thing I ever experienced because I was off and running from there. I say that because it kind of gives an example of what they're talking about with the dopamine receptors and how this, trying the Oxycontin was like magic to my brain. It was there. Long story short, I have a very, very brief time to talk about my personal experience before I get into the peer work. But I ended up addicted to heroin. I used IV heroin for a while. That played out like it does for most people in the system today. Luckily, I didn't die, but I ended up homeless on the streets. I was actually in Salt Lake City at the time, had gone through a couple different treatment attempts, didn't work for me, and I ended up in the legal system, because that's what happens to people who use drugs right now. I experienced several overdoses, kind of the whole 9 yards. I'm sure you guys have heard it before, and I was no different than anyone else. And it's miserable. It really is. I don't know where, I think the lady in here that was talking about going through a detox is not in here. She left. So I feel for her. It's miserable. People are not out there using to have fun. They're using to survive, and they're using to be well, because the baseline state when you're addicted to opiates is being sick, really, 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 really sick. And it's like having the worst flu you've ever had in your life, except it never goes away unless you do an opiate. And so that's where I was at, and I was really lucky, and this is an important caveat, because I was young and on my parents' insurance through all of this. So I basically, and it was good insurance, so when I wanted to take another shot at treatment, I was able to, and I was able to get it paid for through insurance. And that is not the case for a lot of people, and so I want to acknowledge that, because that's some of my own privilege. But anyways, the last time I reached out to my parents and I was like, I really need to do something again. I got into treatment, and for whatever reason it worked for me. Well, not for whatever reason, there's a lot of reasons. And I like what Lydia said about skills and pills, because that was actually my experience. So I did a long residential treatment stay, followed by a bunch of intensive outpatient. I did medication-assisted treatment, or medication-supported recovery. Is that right? I might co-opt that. I like that. I did a ton of counseling. It was finally brought to my attention that the drugs were not the problem. It was all this other stuff, all this trauma and shame, and mental health and all this other junk that was driving me to use. And so it was really important for me to figure that out. And I don't think I would have been able to do that if I wasn't first able to stabilize on the medications, so that I could actually free those executive functions that they were talking about earlier up to think about some of these things. I also did a ton of 12 steps early on, and if you had asked me then about Suboxone or methadone or anything like that, I would have told you that people on those aren't really clean, because that's the system that I was in when I was in treatment. And that's still common among 12-step communities. Now I am on the complete other end of the spectrum with that, but that's where I was then. And it was helpful for me. The 12 steps were helpful to gain friends that were doing the same things, and to get connected with people, and to stay on the right track. I lived in a sober living house for a long time. I just basically did all the things that are recommended, and it worked. I think another big thing in this, okay, I'm going way over what I thought, so I'm going to fast forward. So one of the things that I think is really important that I try to do with people now is to focus on setting goals and what you hope for in the future, because you don't just get into recovery to be in recovery, you get into recovery to live your life, and to do the things that you wanted to do that drugs got in the way of. So let me fast forward here. To impact. So what is impact? Impact is an interdisciplinary team at the hospital. So there's physicians, nurses, social workers, research assistants, and peers. And we are a consult service. So people come in there super sick, and they identify, or they have a positive UA, or they identify with substance use. And then they get asked if they want to see impact. And if they're smart, they say no. And if they're not smart, they say maybe. And then they get jumped by our team, and we use the hospital stay as a reachable moment to do a treatment intervention. And the preliminary results, which aren't published yet, so hopefully Honora doesn't yell at me, the director of the team, but the preliminary results are that the people coming out of impact are twice as likely to remain engaged in treatment compared to controls at, I can't remember what mark, I think 30 days maybe, which is pretty good. Anyways, so my role as a peer, I'm basically in there I mean, it's really simple. It's being somebody who's gone through the same things, and being able to just level with people that are in the hospital, and give them support and validate their experience, and give them a friendly face, because the hospital is a pretty traumatic place, and the healthcare in general is a pretty traumatic system. And for people that are used to living on the streets and surviving, getting thrown into an environment like that is hard. And then you throw in a little opioid withdrawal, and it's really hard. And so it's really important for people to be able to have somebody that they identify with in there and make it through their hospital stay. And so a lot of what I do is relationship building, like affirming people's experiences, giving people an ally or an advocate within the system, being a point of engagement. Like, it's hard enough just to get people to complete their hospital stays. We have a ton of people on IV antibiotics for long periods of time that can't complete because it's such a hard environment to be in. And so having peers there gives them somebody to talk to and keep them engaged in their treatment so they can complete treatment and not get reinfected and end up having to have heart surgery or whatever because of their untreated endocarditis. I do a lot of just helping people navigate the system. It's a really complex, difficult system to deal with. That's just the hospital, let alone when they get out into the community. So I do a lot of that. And then that's the other big piece of my job, is following up with people after they discharge, because we have all this stuff we can do for them while they're in the hospital. But when they discharge, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road and things get real. And the reality is that most people are not able to continue doing what we set up for them in the hospital. And that's, honestly the biggest barriers right now is the community systems aren't there to support people. No matter how much we do for them in the hospital, if they can't step into an environment that's going to support them, it's not going to work out. Like, it's impossible to manage a chronic disease living on the streets and deal with your addiction or whatever. It just doesn't, it's too much. And then the other big thing is we kind of function as like a rapid access to treatment thing. So people will get started on Suboxone or methadone or nothing if they don't want to, and then we bridge them to community providers, whether that be a methadone clinic or a Suboxone prescriber or whatever. But the weird thing is the medications that are saving people's lives and preventing them from overdose are also discriminated against in the community. So there's certain treatment programs we want to get people into, or housing programs, but we can't get them into them because they're on methadone or Suboxone. It's completely backwards. And that's one of the biggest policy things that needs to change, is to not discriminate against these medications. And also legal things like methadone or Suboxone could save someone's life and keep them in the hospital, but because they are on parole or have a warrant out, we can't start them because they might get arrested and then they won't give it to them in jail, and then they're going to detox and it's going to be miserable. So again, backwards. Why is it the way it is? I don't understand. Anyway, so you guys can all lobby whoever you need to start those conversations. And I want to just read a quick quote from one of the doctors on the team that something she said about peers, which is that peers model the importance of connection and trust and even touch, elements that are tragically often lost in the middle of medical care. And I think that just really highlights the human component that peers bring into the healthcare system that is understandably not as human as it could be all the time. So just kind of to close, because I think I probably have already gone over, and looking at the big picture of things, is I know it's really, really hard to have compassion and understanding and be able to deliver treatment to people when they're fresh off the streets and smell terrible and are pissed off and are in withdrawal and are yelling at you about giving them their oxycodone or Dilaudid or whatever. But just keep in mind all the trauma and the shame and everything else that they've been carrying around for so long that has led them to that point of being in front of you, and the fact that they are in front of you seeking treatment. And keep that in mind, because that person, I was that person not that long ago, has a whole life ahead of them, and if they get the treatment they need, that works for them, not what somebody else says works for them, but what works for them, then you don't know what they're capable of. I mean, I never thought I'd be able to come back from that and, finish a master's degree, get into medical school, get married, do all these amazing things that I'm doing right now. All these things, and it would not have been possible unless I was able to take advantage of the appropriate treatment that I needed when I needed it. That's all I got.
I have these fantasies about what a trauma-informed community looks like and what a trauma-informed provider looks like. Like if I took my daughter, who has only got 3 ACEs that I know of so far, and in my family and my sister and my generation, we all have 10 plus ACEs, and we've broken those cycles. But what would happen if I took my kiddo, if they were struggling with something, to their provider, and that provider was aware of all of the things? They knew what ACEs were. They knew to ask the right questions. So whenever I meet people who are going into the medical community, who are coming in to be providers that have this understanding of how to humanize our care, how to be trauma-informed, how to manage those risks and those challenges, it really gives me hope. And Chris didn't mention it, but he's got his master's in public health and he was just accepted to medical school. So it gives me a great amount of hope and inspiration to know that we have people coming in who are going to be the doctors that our kids are going to see and our peers are going to see, and that those people are coming from not just lived experiences and successes and healing, but also really getting it. And that's very inspiring to me. So thank you, Chris.